Thank you so much, Rabbi Shipman, and thank you for everything you've done for the weekend. It is a pleasure to be with Professor Shapiro, known to me as Marc since my childhood, where we were together in NCSY and also worked in the same camp in the summers. You may not know that he's an outstanding tennis player and taught tennis. Little fun fact, and we have a lot of friends in the audience. I just want to give a special shout out to other childhood friends and Doberman family, and wish you and your husband happy 90th birthdays. Very special. Very special. So tonight we're going to have a conversation. Marc and I overlapped a little bit at Harvard, and also very importantly, his son Josh is one of our Sacks scholars this year. So continuing in a tradition of Jewish scholarship. Marc, I was surprised that you wrote a book on Rav Kook. I'm not going to lie. And in your preface, it sounds like you were surprised that you wrote a book on Rav Kook. So tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this, given other publications that you've had, and why did you choose, out of his extensive writings, very select topics?
Again, thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure to be with Erica. And since you mentioned my son Josh, I have to put a plug in the Y Studs Hanukkah video. After we leave here, go check it out. Because, well, Y Studs. They're all great. So why did I write about Rav Kook? And you're right, I never thought of myself as a cookie and cookist, whatever they call it. And I think many of us know the standard views of Rav Kook, which are important, obviously, that all Jews, we're all a unity, the special place of the land of Israel. That can't just sit back and wait for the redemption. It's the quietest view. We have to be involved in it. And those are well-known views and, very much Eretz Yisrael centered. But around First Times came out in 99, the Shmona Tlutzim, it's called, the 8 notebooks from which many of the standard writings of Rav Kook come out of. And then in the last 25 years, a whole series of books of his have been published, books that were suppressed because of some of the things they say. And we see a much broader Rav Kook with all sorts of interesting ideas. And even if you're not really tied into so many of, Rav Kook's Kabbalah and Eretz Yisrael focus, these volumes are full of fascinating information that speak to us in so many different ways. And it's, as I'm going through the Shmona Tlutzim, it's those areas that I felt drawn to. And that's why I wrote the book. After reading it and for all these years and writing about certain sections of it, I thought that Rav Kook has something to say which hasn't been said already to us, and no one's written about it, which is really not the Rav Kook that everyone knows. In fact, I know people in Israel would say, they have this idea that when Rav Kook went to Eretz Yisrael, the Chutz La'aretz Torah was superseded by Eretz Yisrael Torah. So a lot of people would say that the writings that I focus on are no longer relevant because they were superseded. Well, I don't know if that's true, and if it is true, then we have to speak about 2 Rav Kooks, because when he wrote these, he was also a gadol. But the fact is that in the Chutz La'aretz, before he comes to Eretz Yisrael, and before he's focusing on the particularism of Jews and of Eretz Yisrael, he was a very broad thinker, and so much of what he says, I think, is very relevant to us as Orthodox Jews, non-Orthodox Jews, Haredi Jews, the situation we're in, and that's what drew me to him. It's precisely the writings that were suppressed, that no one else that they didn't want us to see.
And it's interesting, and we'll talk a little more about this later, but you make a certain appeal to the modern Orthodox community about studying Rav Kook. I have to confess that until I went to Israel for my seminary year, I really knew nothing about Rabbi Kook. I don't even know if his name was mentioned in my education, or maybe I just didn't pay attention. And his works are so impenetrable in many ways. The language is very mystical, it's flourishing. It's hard to have someone who's translating this into an idiom that you can understand. So I'm wondering why the specific focus on modern Orthodoxy.
Well, I mean, the so-called Haredi world today wouldn't like what he writes, and they'd be opposed to him. Although, for the sake of accuracy, we need to point out that in his day, they didn't call it Haredi. In those days, Haredi just meant Orthodox. But the forefathers of what today we call the Haredi world were in his side, almost exclusively. Think about Rishon Zalman Auerbach's family, Rishon Zalman Meltzer, Rav Elyashiv, Rav Kook was the Masada Kedushin, both Rav Elyashiv and Rosh Hashanah Auerbach. The Litvish world, that doesn't mean that they all agreed with what he said, but they were in his camp in the great dispute that broke out, and they regarded him as the Rav of Jerusalem. Since his passing, especially in the last 50 years or so, he has been pushed out of that world into more of the religious Zionist type of world.
With a lot of political implications.
Sure, and so when I speak, but it's more than that, because the things he speaks about, so for example, the idea of a developing morality, the idea that not that the Torah changes, but that our understanding of it changes, and that we're sensitive to things that people in previous generations were not sensitive to, and therefore morality as we recognize it has developed, and this is something Torah is written anew, as it were, in every generation. We see things that we didn't see. And if anyone, by the way, doubts this empirically, just look at how we regard something like slavery or war. I mean, the idea of a permissible war, discretionary war, that's a recognizable category. And no one was troubled by this morally hundreds of years ago. But today, who's going to argue that a king, because he wants to expand his territory, should put our children's lives at risk and cause them to die just because of that? The idea of slavery, the notion that we can own someone else. I mean, these are things that, if you just are honest, you recognize that. And Rav Kook sees this as part of a continuing revelation as we get closer to the Messianic age, etc. Rav Kook speaks about the need for a broadened curriculum, the need that not just study Talmud, that every person has what to offer, that non-Jews and even their religions have what to offer them. And this is something we should recognize and see the positive. And I'll just give you one example to show you how he goes so much against the grain. And you mentioned, the right-wing world. This is the sort of thing that Rav Yehuda suppressed a lot of this because of his son.
Rav Yehuda is his son.
Yeah, his son. But in the traditional world, I wouldn't even say just the Haredi world. Growing up in yeshivas, we're taught that the rabbis have everything, and we're the recipients. That is the Hamonah. They give us the Torah, and we receive it. And they don't have anything to take from us. But Rav Kook explains, no, everyone has a purpose. And when it comes to what he calls natural morality, Musar TV, this is preserved in a purer form among the religious masses than the rabbis. The rabbis, because they focus so much on Talmud study, the expression is the Tara Tesheretz. They can come up with all sorts of immoral ideas and justify it Talmudically because they've lost touch of the simple, pure morality that the simple Jewish masses have. Now, obviously, this is very subversive because, what happened to Das Torah? But Rav Kook says that each side needs the other. The masses need the rabbis to teach them what the halacha is, but the rabbis need the masses to keep them on the straight and narrow. And by the way, if anyone has any doubts about this, I think if you have a Das Torah perspective, I don't see how you can explain what happened with the sexual abuse scandals. We had great rabbis covering these things up, and yet the religious masses understood this was wrong, and they forced the issue. But from Rav Kook's perspective, it makes perfect sense because sometimes, look, if you look in the Gemara, it doesn't tell you anything about, the devastating effects of sexual abuse. So if you only have a Talmud curriculum and that's your whole knowledge, you're not going to be sensitive to this. But it's dafka the religious masses, he says, that often sense things that the rabbis don't. So you need a dialectic, the combination of the two together. Now that is an idea that's very powerful. I can elaborate on it, but this is obviously something that would be appealing to people in the modern Orthodox world, not so much maybe in the more right-wing world.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about his relationship also with Chilonim and the way in which he understood in a very sort of radical way his approach to Chilonim in the country and those who built the state. But for a moment, you make a really interesting distinction in the book between Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's halachic man and what you call Rav Kook as the agadic man. So number one, I'd love you to explain to our audience tonight what you see as, why halachic man, even though of course he wrote on that, agadic man, how you came up with that. And then I know this is going to be a crazy question, but if Rav Kook had been the founder of Yeshiva University, how do you think it would be different today? How do you think orthodoxy in this country would be different?
Okay, very interesting question.
So let's start with the guy.
We all know that Rav Soloveitchik was not the founder either. He wasn't even officially, he didn't have any more authority than any other Rosh Yeshiva. It was all
he did ordain 2,000 right? Over 2,000 Musmachim. And so you can feel that there was an ethos, a Soloveitchik ethos. I certainly grew up with that in high school. My teachers were his students. And I think that's true for many people, the way that he framed modern Orthodoxy in this country, or Orthodoxy in this country. So start with the discrepancy or the distinction between these two.
Well, first I called him, the Rav is called, of course, halachic man because of his famous work. I called Rav Kook Agadic man, understanding Agadah to mean not just non-halachic sections of the Talmud, but anything non-halachic, philosophy, Musar, all those areas that Rav Kook thought we have to give a great deal of attention to. Rav Soloveitchik, his focus was on Talmud study, the halacha, and the pure halacha, not halacha lamasa, which is actually itself in opposition to Rav Kook, because Rav Kook wrote the halacha berura on the Gemara. He really had the idea of halacha lamasa. In fact, when Rav Shimon Shkop wanted to come to Eretz Yisrael and be Rosh Hashiva, America's Rav, the answer given was no, because we don't want this sort of learning, this brisker type of learning. We're the old school, and Rav Soloveitchik obviously was very important in modern Orthodoxy, but I also think we need to put it in perspective because there's a lot in modern Orthodoxy and religious Zionism that did not follow Rav Soloveitchik. So, for instance, I assume initial they said today the prayer for the state of Israel with Reshit Smicha Kulatenu, something we'll come back to maybe later. Rav Soloveitchik was opposed to this. Rav Soloveitchik, in many areas, in the early years, the 50s, the 60s, his reputation in his later years and posthumously was more significant in many ways than, especially in the early decades. If Rav Kook was here instead of him, first of all, you would have more of a focus on Eretz Yisrael. Yes, Rav Soloveitchik is known as a Zionist. He wrote classic works, Kol Dodi Fake, etc. But on the other hand, he's a very different sort of Zionist. First of all, whoever heard of a Zionist who never visited the state of Israel? So already you see you're dealing, and not only that, who told all the students not to go. So you're dealing with it. And by the way, more of students went to Eretz Yisrael and became leaders of Torah there than any other Rosh Hashiva. So despite what he said, if you're a Zionist, he must have been doing something right. But clearly, and if you've read the Rav Speaking Loud, you know that his Zionism, they're still on the inside. The expression I like to say is you could take the man out of brisk, you can't take brisk out of the man, because or the letters I published in Chakira, we have one of the editors here, you could see that the Rav was not a complete love. It was like Yamin, Makarev Smol Doche. He had issues, strong issues with religious Zionism in the way that even though when he puts on his suit and he gets up and speaks at the Mizrahi convention, he's towing the line in his private letters and his private conversation. He's much more ambivalent about it in a way that Rav Kook never would have been. Look, Rav Kook thought that if you live in Chutz Haaretz, you are a defective Jew. You can't be a complete Jew unless you live in Eretz Yisrael. In the Rav Speaking Aloud, he's told about it. I mean, he responds to this. I think one of the students asked, does the Ramban says this? So it goes back to the Ramban. And the Rav is like, we can't accept this, Ramban. We can't accept this. I mean, what? My grandfather wasn't a complete Jew. The Rambam wasn't a complete Jew. It doesn't make sense for him. Second of all, Rav Kook believed in a broadened curriculum. Why Rav Kook wanted to create a philosophy of Judaism out of halacha. That's not Rav Kook. In fact, Rav Kook, if you adopt this typology of Professor Tversky of Talmudists, philosophers, and mystics, the Rav is obviously a Talmudist, but Rav Kook is not a Talmudist. He says that he says, I'm good at Talmud, I can do poem like the rest of them, but he has to do that because that's his job. I mean, if he had his way, he'd be soaring the stratosphere in mysticism. And so he was a very much not Talmudically oriented person. That is, you have to know that, but he's moving beyond that. Emunah, the study of Emunah was very important for him. Broadened study of Tanakh and all of his other ideas that don't fit in well, I think, with Rav Soloveitchik's perspective. So it'll be a much broadened orthodoxy, but it'll be an orthodoxy who followed him, which couldn't really exist in America. Because, like I said... So
do you think he could have been the head of YU? In other words, do you see how the curriculum might be different?
Well, I mean, he could be the head of YU, but he'd be the head of YU always telling people you have to leave America. So that doesn't, I don't know if YU would want to hire someone to be in that position.
Bad for admissions.
Yeah.
No, in terms of the framing of, I mean, I'll just say you didn't deal with this so much in the book, but When you think of one of Rav Soloveitchik's most important works, The Lonely Man of Faith, not as a Talmudist, but really as a philosopher, sort of existential sense that we're born alone, that we die alone, that there's this sort of hole or ache that will, perpetually exist. I remember reading that as a high school student, and it's a very daunting way of viewing the world. Then you start learning Rav Kook, and Rav Kook it's no one feels lonely and isolated or
much more optimistic.
Much more optimistic. And I wondered if we're not teaching enough of Rav Kook in the United States to help struggling young Jews who in high school appreciate a diet which is not exclusively Talmud.
Well, I think they recognize that in Israel. Rav Kook spoke, first of all, how every person has talents. And that's their talents in different ways, and very much opposed to the Talmud-only curriculum, which is the Brisker curriculum and the yeshiva curriculum, not just the Brisker yeshiva. But the yeshivas today in Israel, I think, recognize that. Even at YU, where you are, you have a movement of neo-Hasidism. Yeshiva University, the Brisker, the Lithuanian yeshiva par excellence hired a mashgiach from a Hasidic tradition. So I think everyone recognizes, like Rav Kook spoke about, that people have different interests, different talents, and you can't feed them the same thing. Rav Kook believed that, you wander Eretz Yisrael to you. You go and you sense the holiness, and that speaks to you. He was very much influenced by Breslov, by other Hasidic groups. I mean, this is something you can't imagine. Rav Kook was very influenced by the Maharal. If you want to know about Rav Hutner, of course, people identify Rav Hutner and the Maharal, but Rav Hutner was influenced by Rav Kook. Rav Kook studied Maharal in Lithuania. We have Rav Soloveitchik on tape at one of the Archikalas where someone challenged him. Well, the Maharal says this, and this is where the Rav says, I wish I could find the tape. I mean, he says, I don't have the answer for the Maharal. It's not in our tradition. It's not part of our Masonga. I mean, that's it's a very small curriculum. If you look at halachic man sources, I mean, it's much more limited than Rav Kook, who again wanted to soar the heavens and not be constrained. Rav Kook speaks about halacha. It's a problem. We have to follow it, but it's a problem because it constrains us. It constrains this highly spiritual person. Your pratim, details you're focused on. For the Rav, the details are the beauty of it. It brings out. He says we take the pots and the pans.
You look at sunrise and
look at sunrise, and you think. But for Rav Kook, the details are a problem. We have to overcome the details because we want to connect to God, and the details are necessary. But he's very Hasidic. Hasidim had a problem with these details also.
So I mean, I want to make sure that we're not overstating this, because at least in my understanding and my reading of your book and other books about Rav Kook, that Rav Kook acknowledges halacha wasn't a constraint. It was the architecture and structure of his life. But certainly in his journals, he expresses. I spent a whole summer reading Chadarav in Hebrew and trying to understand these excerpts from his notebooks of seeing that there were certain limitations. Another thing, and you bring up in the book, is that Rav Kook was very critical of other rabbis of the generation. He said that they were in a deep slumber. They didn't recognize the needs of the generation. And I'm wondering what you think the deep slumber was about. What did he feel they were not doing?
Well, there's a number of things, but the primary one is that in the end of the 19th century, God was calling us to become a complete people. We had been for 1,800 years a defective people. All we had was spirituality. We didn't have physicality. We were exiled from our land. That's not the way you're supposed to live. Jews are supposed to live in their land. And now was the time to return. And it was precisely the rabbis, in large measure, who didn't recognize it. And they were telling people, no, you wait here, wait in the diaspora. God will bring you back. So that's one example. And you needed the irreligious precisely to recognize that God was, all the other nations were being called to nationalism. They recognized, what it meant to be a people. We're the first nation. And the rabbis didn't recognize that. But then in all the areas he spoke about, the need for a broadened curriculum, that now as we enter a new era, we have to offer people different options. And all the things that Rav Kook speaks about are examples where he breaks that I do in the book. we'll talk about some of them in a few minutes, I guess, but where he breaks with the rabbinic mainstream, those he would say the rabbis are in a slumber. So now he wrote these not just in his private journal, but he writes letters on it and he spoke about it. So people ask, well, why would he say all these things? I think the answer is he saw himself as a prophet, a prophetic figure, maybe even real prophecy. I mean, because we have one example which is censored by the Nazir, but you can see the short of the Nazarite. He has a student.
He has a student.
His three major students are Rav David Cohen, his son, Rav Kook, Rav Charlap, who's the grandfather of Rav Charlap from YU, passed away recently, and also Rav David Cohen, the Nazir. This is a very pious, holy figure, the father of Shinish, called Rav Haifa. A lot of people mistakenly think that he became a Nazarite, the first recorded Nazarite in hundreds of years. But a lot of people think he became a Nazir because of Rav Kook's influence. It's not true. He was a Nazir before he met Rav Kook. So already we see he's an interesting person. The Nazir, what a person. I told in my class the other night that he was engaged and he went to Germany to study, and then World War I breaks out. He makes his way there to Israel. His wife is stuck behind, now it's the Iron Curtain. I think it was 12 years. And finally she gets out. She makes her way there to Israel. Now, he kept a picture of her on his desk. Can you imagine today in yeshiva circles saying that some cute picture, but he wanted to be faithful to her. That's who he's engaged in. She arrives in Yerushalayim. Wouldn't you know, he's on a tiny steamboat that day. So they had to bring Sacks-Herenstein brought a basin together to, remove the tiny steamboat so he could speak to his fiance. But
that's a great fun fact.
Yes, he has a diary, But he censored a passage where Rav Kook wonders, am I a false prophet? But even if it's not prophecy in an actual sense, Rav Kook thought that the other rabbis were not speaking this, so he had to say it. And we know that a prophet is obligated to prophesy. You can't hold it back. It's a sin. So I think that explains why Rav Kook believed. Rav Kook said that the light, his books are titled Light. I wrote this, I wrote that. He said the light can't be stopped up. It has to be pushed out. But the light can't be stopped up. It has to be let out. The problem is, he says, but my censors don't let me. His censors, that his son, the Nazir. But he said, that's why I think all these texts, Rav Aviner says you can't use these texts. Rav Kook never published that. Look, at the end of the day, they've been published, so they're there. We can't really ignore them. But
they were still part of who he was.
There it was. He says you can't hold back the light. And this is part of the light that the other rabbis don't recognize, that God wants us to live. At the end of the day, in the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, we're not supposed to be living as we were in the 18th or the 17th century in Warsaw or Vilna. God's providence has put us in a certain place that now we have to move in a different direction. And some people will see it and others will not see it. And the ones who don't see it are the ones in the slumber.
Yeah, Rav Kook had been attacked in his lifetime. And people complained about it, and something I felt that was very thoughtful in the way you handled. In the book, you talked about his soul being torn, and rather than defend himself, he said, "Whoever said about me that my soul is torn expressed it well." Right? No, so someone criticized him by saying your soul is torn, and he said, "That's true. Certainly, it is torn. A human whose soul is not torn is inconceivable." What do you think he meant by that? A human whose soul is not torn is inconceivable.
Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg said that when you say about great thinkers that their souls are all at peace within them and everything is quiet, that's not a compliment. And Rav Soloveitchik also was famous. He has that footnote, what is it, footnote number 4 or something in a box. Man, I mean, how faith is stormy. It's not quiet. It's not like that Reform Rabbi's book, whose name escapes me, from the 1950s. Maybe some of you know it, or was it the 60s? Peace of mind, it's called. I think people go to religion for peace of mind, but the Soloveitchik says religion doesn't give you peace of mind; it keeps you up at night. So, what he meant, I think, is that he is being torn in so many different directions. So, on the one hand, look, he loves all Jews. We're all unity. On the other hand, these Jews are sinners. How can you love Jews like this who are sinners? He wants to follow what the great rabbis say. On the other hand, the great rabbis are missing the point. They're not returning to Eretz Yisrael. He clearly follows halacha, but on the other hand, problems are raised with halacha, and because you want to, like I said, soar the heavens, and then you're being brought down to earth. You have to answer a Shiloh, or it's time to daven, but maybe you're not ready to daven. Like the Hasidim, they can delay their davening until they're ready. But if you're not a Chassid, you have to daven at this time, even though maybe you're not ready for it. So your soul was torn. He's moved philosophy, the Rambam's philosophy. On the other hand, Kabbalah. How can those two be brought together? The study of Talmud versus writing poetry. All these things tear at him. And let me give you a good example, I think. As I mentioned, he wants to love Jews. I should say really love most Jews. And yet, but there's halachas. Let me explain what I mean by this. Because he has a famous eulogy of these irreligious Jews. A lot of the Jews who came to Eretz Yisrael in those days were irreligious, anti-religious atheists, and they were killed. They were killed by Arabs. So, Toshim, on the other hand, they're complete heretics. And he reflects on this in this eulogy he gives. But it goes more than that. And I think I would not have mentioned this before 2 years ago, but it's worth mentioning it now. Rav Kook had an antagonist, an adversary. His name was Rav Yaakov David Wolofsky. He's known as the Ritibaz. Great Rav from Slutsk, and then he comes to Chicago, and then he goes to Eretz Yisrael. He wrote a famous commentary on the Yerushalmi. Unfortunately, wherever he went, Machokas followed him. So when he came to Eretz Yisrael, the rabbis told him to go to Tzfat. Because at least in Tzfat, you stay in Jerusalem, be Machokas. But he writes to Rav Kook, how can you befriend all these irreligious Jews coming? We have halachas about how you're supposed to relate to these people. Can't count them in a minyan, all these things, and I don't need to go into the details now. We sort of forget about them today because we assume that all the irreligious, they don't know any better, all these sorts of things. So he writes to Rav Kook, though, these are heretics, these are atheists, and how can you relate to them? Rav Kook says, very interestingly, this letter has been translated in English. He says you have to understand something, that when the sages spoke about these figures that you just mentioned, they weren't referring to these type of Jews. They're referring to these type of Jews, although they're irreligious, they're more than irreligious, they're heretics, they have what he calls a segulah, especially segulah means treasure. They're connected to the Jewish people. What do we mean by this? These are people who could have gone to America, South Africa, England, they could have stayed as Buddhists in Vilna. What do? They go to Eretz Yisrael. Terrible place in those days, malaria, they have to, difficulty with marauders, and they sacrifice their health and sometimes their life. They give of themselves for the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael, even though consciously they are in opposition to Torah, they want to build a new society. He says, but these people, we have to extend our arm to them and try to influence them positively. In fact, he's really the leader, the founder of the Kira movement. He led the first groups to go visit the irreligious settlements. So these are not the people that the sages were speaking about. He says, but there are people like that who the sages were speaking about. And I think it's very relevant today. Because look, especially after October 7th, we have many so-called irreligious Jews. They're not ritually religious, but they're connected to the Jewish people, especially after October 7th. They give tzedakah. They're the people that Rav Kook spoke about, that they're irreligious, but they're still in our broader community because they have the segulah. Then there's the other people. And the hero of Kook, he's not a Chabad chassid, who every single Jew has the pintal yid, you have to welcome him in. Chabad likes to take credit for Rav Kook, as his mother was Chabad. But his mother was not from Chabad. His mother was from the other group, Kappas, which becomes Barois. So that's a subject in of itself. But Rav Kook is not Chabad. There are Jews, those Jews who are in opposition to the Jewish people. He met these Jews. He had dealings with them in London. Assimilated Jewish leaders lobbied against the Balfour Declaration. Those people who do not have the Segulah, I dare say we have them today, and I don't just mean the Torah Karta, the Jews who are marching for Hamas, all that, they do not have the Segulah. They are Parishman at Tzibur. Rambam says a Parishman at Tzibur is one who doesn't mourn when Jews are mourning. These are people, according to Rav Kook, who are outside the fold. And he agrees with the Ritbaz. They do not have the Segulah unless they do tshuva. They are not part of our community. So the idea that Rav Kook loved all Jews, it's not true. Even though it's often said, he loved those Jews who are deserving of love, who even if they're not religious, they are connected to the Jewish people. But those people who are traitors, who are enemies, who try to undermine the Jewish people, Rav Kook agrees with the Ritbaz that they are b'chutz l'machaneh. I was told that after one of these protests in Washington, D.C., one of the rallies, the Torah Karta, they came to one of the shuls, and I think it was might have been Georgetown Synagogue, because someone didn't know which shul it was, and there was a debate, do you let them into Daven? And they said in the end, they let them in. For Rav Kook, clearly you can't let them in. You can't count them in the minyan. They're not part of our kehillah. Yeah.
Well, they're not outside the Kingsway Jewish Center, so I don't know. One of your lengthiest, I think it's the lengthiest chapter here, Torah, History, and Science. You talk about the importance of science for Rav Kook. There's been a lot published on his views on evolution from before. You gave other examples in the chapter, and you said that rabbis who reject science and the developments in science risk the danger of pushing away Jews who obviously are more intellectual. Can you give us some examples on why you think science is important for him?
Okay, because if you're educated, let's say, in modern knowledge, modern learning, and you accept certain things as basic scientific, let's say, facts, and then you have rabbis who are, your rabbi, let's say, is declaring that to believe this is heresy. Well, if you're already a heretic, well, then why are you observing Shabbos anymore? So these rabbis, their closed-minded views are of necessity going to lead to people becoming heretics because they are going to be pushing all these people out of the fold. Now, how to explain the phenomenon of these rabbis? That's also interesting because Rav Kook says that, it's very easy. He says it's people who are machmir on issues. You usually think about halacha being stringent, but you can also be stringent on, let's say, hashkafa. And he says these rabbis are machmir in these areas. And since they're so machmir, they drive people out. But they're machmir because they don't have the knowledge. That's the thing. We know that in halacha, anyone can be machmir. As they say in the yeshiva circles, you need the broad shoulders to be mekel. You can only be mekel if you have the knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge, well, then you don't know and you can't have a lenient argument. So you have to be machmir. He says the problem is, a lot of these rabbis, they don't know the Jewish philosophical tradition. They forget the Moreh Nevuchim, which they don't know either. They don't know Sadi, they don't know Sacks-Herenstein. So their view of what acceptable Jewish doctrine is very narrow, and they assume that a view which they think is correct is not just correct, but is a principle of faith. And therefore, anyone who diverges from it is rejecting a principle of faith, Mikar Amuna, and is not Bikoris. Well, okay, so Rav Kook doesn't say what he's thinking about, but clearly he's talking about evolution as well as other things. Rav Kook had believed that evolution is compatible with Torah. So if you're telling all these people who believe things that the scientific world believes, that now they're heretics, they basically told them there's no need for them to be religious anymore. Rav Kook's approach was very different. We assume he says that every scientific theory, so even if it's only a theory, we have to ask ourselves, can this be put in line with Torah, and how do we do this? And because if it is proven, then you have to find a way that Torah has to be true. And if science is true, Torah can't be in opposition to this. There were rabbis who said that that Copernican astronomy is heretical because the Torah says that the sun revolves around the earth, and therefore this is an ikar of Torah. So, if you lived in an era when then it became obvious that the earth revolves around the sun, you'd be justified in rejecting Torah, because after all, the rabbis said that it's an ikar emunah to believe that the sun goes around the earth. So with this sort of, Rav Kook was aware of this, is this sort of short-sighted understanding without seeing the long view. Rav Kook understand how views in the past have changed, and he says you have to distinguish between ikarei emunah, basic emunah, and also things that work in certain times but can be adjusted. So, for example, Tamia mitzvos. We explain certain mitzvos in a certain way. That doesn't mean that these are eternal explanations. A later generation can offer different ways. And so it's very important to know the difference between ikarei emunah, things that are not ikarei emunah. And that's why he blames these rabbis for driving people away, for not understanding this important point.
To that point, you have another chapter where you deal with heresy and Rav Kook's approach to heresy, where he says, that if rabbis distort reality or distort Jewish thought, they risk killing someone's soul. So taking, some responsibility for heretical ideas, because you're sort of pushing people away. Can you talk about his views around heresy and why you included that as a chapter?
Well, this is the thing I mentioned there. That's a very interesting passage, which also, for some reason, Yehuda didn't publish it. Had he published it, it would have stopped a lot of the heresy hunting, maybe in the religious Zionist world. This is in Shmona Kvatzim, Book 1, sections 30 and 31. Rav Kook says, he says, it's an amazing thing. He says, when it comes to heresy, a belief is heretical, but you are not a heretic. Being a heretic meaning destroying your soul, all the things that we were saying heretics, unless the belief comes into practice in some way. But if the belief just remains, I guess it's like in the ether, an idea in someone's mind, that does not qualify you as a heretic of the sort that you lose your share in the Olam Haba. Now, this is an amazing thing to say. And he says, by the way, in this, we're very close to the Rivad's position. The Ravad famously disagrees with the Rambam. The Rambam says anyone who believes God has a physical form, it doesn't matter why you say that, you're a heretic. And the Ravad says, why does he call him a heretic? If you don't know any better, you read Psukim and you take them simplistically, you're wrong, but you're not a heretic. So Rav Kook's, this is amazing, because first of all, Rav Kook he's not legitimizing what we call orthopraxy as l'chachila, but as b'diavad. He is saying that someone who is part of the Orthodox community observes Torah and mitzvos, but his ideas are not in line with acceptable, correct ideas, but he's still part of the community. He's not a heretic. So that's a huge welcome, I guess, for all the people who feel because their view, their doctrines are not in line with whatever 13 principles, whatever. I know someone wrote a book on the 13 principles, maybe it's a little broader. But certainly, whatever the doctrines are, you're not out. Your views are wrong, but you're in the fold, number one. Number two, this is a complete rejection of the Rambam's entire theory of doctrine, of the 13 principles. Rav Kook says, simply believing in a false doctrine does not make you a heretic if it doesn't come into fruition. Now, I don't know of any earlier source that says that. I mean, he tries to connect it to the Raiva. The problem is the Raiva doesn't apparently even think that this is heretical to think that as a physical form. Maybe Yosef Albo says, if you believe in a doctrine because you think this is what the Torah teaches, even if it's heretical doctrine, you're a kofar b'shogeg, so we don't treat you like you're a heretic. But Rav Kook isn't speaking about people who think this is what the Torah teaches. He's just saying that they have a doctrine which is false doctrine. So this is a very liberal position as you can get, and maybe that's why. Actually, not maybe. I'm certain that's why Rav Kook suppressed this passage.
Okay, so actually, speaking of Rav Yosef Albo, you were interviewed recently by Dr. Shira Weiss in a podcast. Dr. Weiss works at the Sacks-Herenstein Center as assistant director. And for those of you who would like to hear more about the book, I advise you to go on the Sacks-Herenstein website and you can access the podcast there. Shira just put out a new translation of Yosef Albo. It's about 1,700 pages and it'll be out soon through Koren.
Oh, on Sacred Heart.
Indeed, a number of his writings. I want to broaden our conversation. Marc, you've been writing for decades, and you've sort of become a gadfly in terms of the subjects that you are interested in, the kind of sources you're drawn to. Can you tell us how you pick your subjects of study?
Okay. Gadfly, it's an interesting term, controversial, but I still to this day don't understand how, I'm not a theologian, I'm not Ian Greenberg writing ideas that people say it's controversial. I mean,
no, you're citing right.
I mean, if it's controversial to cite opinions that differ from the Rambam, it's controversial to cite the Weinberg. I mean, I'm still, it's a wonder to me, but
it's a reality.
It's a reality, definitely a reality. And the limits of Orthodox theology, they did Forward had an article about this when it came out because the Eichers in Flatbush was sold it, but the one in Borough Park refused to sell it. So I am interested.
We could drive around together to bookstores in Brooklyn.
I would say that I'm interested. I feel like there's a big conspiracy that there's so much interesting stuff written in the past by great thinkers. And growing up in, I read traditional yeshiva education, we're not told about this. And then one day you find out about it, and it's always like, well, you keep it quiet, that this isn't accepted. And that never explained to me actually who determines what's accepted and what's not. So already from my youth in high school, I was always interested in not the heretics, but the great rabbis who had views that were sort of out of the ordinary. And because at the end of the day, when we study halacha, we study all the opinions, even the opinions that are not accepted, because we think it's part of the great circle of Torah. So I never understood why studying the viewpoints of great thinkers, Torah thinkers, should also not be included. So I've always been drawn to these because especially when you find people with interesting, unusual ideas, it says something about them that they're not bound by convention. All our great thinkers were controversial because they were not bound by convention. They had to go where they felt the truth sent them. Not only Rav Kook, Bishop Soloveitchik, Rambam, all our great thinkers we had, Maharal, you go down the list, because they were not afraid to venture where they felt the Torah was taking them. So you need bravery, obviously, for that. Some are more brave than others. Some we see their writings, but they weren't brave enough in their lifetime. So those are the people that draw me to because they're interesting, and I think other people find them interesting. So if I'm going to send, these, as you know, not for yourself, it takes a long time. It's a lot of work to write, and rather do something that you find interesting and that you're not alienated from. So that's what draws me.
Do you have any particular sort of writing rituals or times of day when you write? Because I'm interested in the writing process. What's your writing process?
Yes. Every writer, I think, has different rituals. The sort of things I do, anyone who's read that knows, it needs broad reading. So different areas, I have a Seder. So like in the morning, I try to write, I get up at 5. And although I'm a little upset because I just saw today in one of the papers that you get that apparently that if you want to live long, you have to live. Oh, I know. I saw it. Charlie Kirk's new book. I got an advanced copy on the Shabbos. He writes in there that you can die early if you don't get good sleep. And he tries to get. So
I don't even know what to say about that, but
so maybe I should get up a little later. But I try to write continuously from like 8 to 12, and then I take a break and read. I have a Seder, and then I go back to writing, and then in the evening, when I don't have the koach to write anymore, I do my reading. And I have my different Siddharim, my Seder in philosophy, my Seder in halacha, my Seder in all these things I do. And when I can get through, let's say, the 4 or 5 books I'm reading at one time and do let's say, 15, 20 pages in each one, then I can relax and play on my phone and things.
So do you take extensive notes? Because if you're going from book to book, how do you keep order on so that you can use?
It's interesting. A lot of people ask me, for example, not so much about this book, but the book on the 13 principles and also the book on censorship. Some of you have seen the book on censorship, so it's full of all these sources. You can't really research that. How are you going to research? Where are you going to look to find out that in 18th century Prague, this thing happened, and in 16th century Salonika? It's the result of many, many years of study. And as I do take notes, when I find something, take a look at my Sfarim blog posts. Some of you have read them. I tell you, I'm not revealing a secret here, maybe you know, but it's impossible for anyone to have all that information, right? Just in their head. It's and all these things. But as I'm reading and studying, I mark it. I make notes. I make notes. On a note card, and then I put it into my computer, so it's all there. So what I do on my blog posts give you an insight into how I do it. New ones should be coming out soon. I write the post, the e-car thing I write, which has it all, and also chapters of the book. And then I look in my notes and I include all the extra interesting stuff. So you see in the Rav Kook book also, the main stuff is in the text, but the interesting footnotes, these are stuff over the years I have accumulated and then throw it in. So that's why on Shabbos you can't take notes. So Shabbos, so that's when I do, let's say, more learning, things like that. Because then, it's different. But without a pen, I couldn't do this. I try to copy down everything. And I see I'm not unique. Many other people have do the same thing. How else can you remember this stuff? I don't know if we're
Yeah. Do you use the sticky method?
No, because on Shabbos, I don't do that. Shabbos, I just focus on other things. Right. I don't do my academic stuff. Maybe, am I allowed to even? I don't know, because that's my weekday pursuit. So Shabbos, I have Gemara, I try to learn that. I do other things that are totally separate from, I read Charlie Kirk today, how beautiful Shabbos is. So.
That's very, very impressive. Can you tell us what your next book project is?
Yes, the next book project, which is probably 3/4 the way done. Basically, it's all written, but I need to just revise and add some things. It's a study of Besamim Rosh. It's more a technical study. Besamim Rosh was a forgery, an 18th century forgery. Only about maybe 200 pages. I think I found stuff that no one else has noticed, but the major project, the one I was working on before I got sidetracked, I got sidetracked into Simon Roche because I do these classes on Torah motion. In fact, if anyone wants more about Rav Kook, I did 11 classes on the book in detail. But I did a whole series on the Reform movement, and my argument is at odds with others that Simon Roche should be seen as a proto-reform text. And we went through some of the tshuvot, so that got me into this. But my real project, the one which takes a long time, is I want to do a halachic history of America, going back to colonial times, and all how America influenced halacha. And there's all sorts of fascinating stuff. I even found discussions of Talmud Yisrael in America in the 19th century. But and there's a whole series of halachic texts that were published before World War II in America, which are completely unknown. So that'll be a major project. So both of those I'm working on, but the Simon Roche should be out before that.
And through Lippman?
I don't think Lippman would want this because it's too technical and too parochial. You know, Lippman asked as part of the thing, they want to know will it have broader appeal than just small circle.
Can you explain what that is?
Well, the Simon Roche, there was a rabbi in the 18th century. His name was the son of the chief rabbi of Berlin. His name was Tzvi Levin, and he took the name Saul Berlin. He was the rabbi of Frankfurt, on Oder. There's two Frankfurts, on Main and on Oder, and he was a great rabbi, one of the Gedolim, and he went over to the dark side, and he became a heretic. In fact, the Sipor says you should not. Some guy who wrote a book about the Haskalah, and he had a chapter in there, a section about Saul Berlin, how this. Because this was an important Haskalah writer, and the sniper said not to write about it. And he gave a few reasons, and one of his reasons is that the masses, if they see that a great rabbi can become a heretic, they'll be disillusioned. So here you have a case, though, of a great rabbi who not only becomes a heretic, but he forges a work of responsa in the name of Rav Asher ben Yechiel and other medieval rabbis. These are great, important medieval rabbis with all sorts of reformist ideas. And he passes it off as an authentic rabbinic text. And so it's fascinating, just the history of the Jewish book, Haskalah, and I guess how a genius is used for the wrong purposes. It's not the only guy. We had another genius in the early 20th century. His name was Shlomo Friedlander, and he produced a copy of the Jerusalem Talmud, which fooled a number of the great rabbis. But it's a forgery. So forgeries have always interested me. I'm very interested in forgeries because it's an example of someone using great talents. To be a great forger, you have to have great talents, but using it for the wrong reasons. And I wonder about people like that.
Yeah, fascinating. So I want to honor the time here. So we're going to do this for an hour and give you some time to answer questions, audience questions, and to sell some books. I want to thank you on behalf of the Sacks-Herenstein Center and the Kingsway Jewish Center.
And let me say, it's a big honor, the award from the Sacks Center, and especially since it carries the name of a person who I knew personally, and I was a great admirer of. Although I didn't live up to his, I don't know if the story, if you heard the podcast, I'll tell you everyone else, Rabbi Sacks. I only met him a few times, though we corresponded, and he said to me at one of the meetings at his house in London, he said to me, I should stop writing my parochial stuff, and I should start writing for the Wall Street Journal. The New York Times. Basically wanted me to be him. Stop by your salvation or something, I don't know. And I said to him that, I don't know if I could do that. It's not my interest, but I appreciate the fact that you think that I have something to offer in that respect. The truth is that I'd rather write for the 1,000 people who are interested in these arcane matters than be that public intellectual. But I don't think I could do it, but I always admired and was astounded that in the Jewish world, the leading public intellectual was not just an Orthodox Shomer Shabbos person, but was a rabbi, a great figure like that. And it was an amazing thing that we had, and we're missing it. If only we had him in the last couple of years speaking with moral clarity to the world. So we did appreciate him in his lifetime. Sometimes you don't appreciate it, but now I think we realize how much we're missing by him not being here. So it's a great honor to have his name in a small measure attached to mine.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Shabbat Tov. Have a great day, everyone.
If you have questions, we'll take them as Mark.
Okay, so we'll take the questions over there. Okay, thank you all for coming.